James Weston had always been a law-abiding, no-nonsense homeowner, a man who believed in following the rules, but only if they were fair. He had lived in Clearwater Ridge, a supposedly prestigious HOA-controlled community in Florida, for 5 years without issue. The HOA fees were steep, but James paid them on time. The rules were strict, but he followed them. His lawn was always neatly trimmed, his driveway was spotless, and his house matched the perfect aesthetic the HOA demanded. So when he received a letter from the HOA demanding $2,500 in fines, he was shocked. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead, accused him of multiple violations. Unapproved exterior modifications, he hadn't changed a thing. Unauthorized landscaping changes, he had the same plants since he moved in. Excessive noise complaints, he lived alone and barely even watched TV. At first, James thought it was a clerical mistake, but when he went to speak with the HOA board, he quickly realized this was something much worse. The HOA president, Richard Lawson, a smug, suit-wearing man in his mid-50s, met him in the board's private office. James laid the letter down on the table. "There must be a mistake," he said calmly. "I never made any modifications to my house, and I've never been cited for noise." Richard simply smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, James," he sighed. "This isn't a mistake." James felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Richard folded his hands. The HOA recently had to increase its budget for community enhancements. That money has to come from somewhere. His smirk widened. "You understand, don't you?" James's blood ran cold. This wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't about rules. This was blackmail. "So you're just making up fines to fill your budget?" James growled. Richard shrugged, unfazed. "Think of it as a contribution. If you pay the fines, we waive any further issues. If not," he slid another document across the table. James picked it up and felt rage boil in his chest. It was a notice of lien filing. If James didn't pay the fraudulent fines, the HOA would file a lien against his property, which could eventually lead to foreclosure. He clenched his fists. "You're threatening to take my home?" Richard gave him a mocking laugh. "Let's not be dramatic, James. Just pay the fines, and this all goes away." James stood, shoving the papers back at Richard. "You're making a mistake." Richard's smile didn't waver. "No, James. You are. You have 7 days to pay. After that, you won't have a choice." James walked out, his heart pounding. The HOA had declared war on him. What they didn't realize was that James Weston stormed out of the HOA board office, his heart pounding with rage. Richard Lawson, the smug, suit-wearing president of Clearwater Ridge's HOA, had just tried to blackmail him into paying fake fines, $500 worth of completely fabricated violations. If he refused, they would file a lien on his property and eventually force him into foreclosure. But what Richard didn't know, James wasn't just some random homeowner. He was a former private investigator, and if the HOA wanted to play dirty, he was going to bury them. Step 1. Digging up the dirt. The moment James got home, he went into full investigation mode. He pulled out his file cabinet, which held every HOA-related document he had collected over the years, meeting minutes, newsletters, fee breakdowns, and fine structures. Then he went online, searching for complaints against Clearwater Ridge's HOA. And what he found was infuriating. Over a dozen homeowners had reported sudden violations, all of which coincidentally happened right before the HOA announced new budget increases. 3 families had been foreclosed on over unpaid fines, and Richard Lawson's real estate company had bought 2 of those homes at dirt-cheap prices. Several contractors who had done repairs for the HOA had direct connections to Richard's personal accounts. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. This wasn't just about him. This was a full-blown fraud operation. And now, he had the proof to take them down. Step 2. Gathering witnesses. Knowing he couldn't fight this alone, James started knocking on doors. He spoke to his neighbors, asking if they had similar experiences with the HOA. The stories poured in. Mrs. Patel, a retired schoolteacher, had been fined $1,000 for having unapproved window shutters, the same shutters that had been there for 15 years. The Ramirez family had been charged $800 for parking violations, even though their cars were always in their driveway. Greg Thompson, a former HOA board member, admitted that he resigned after Richard started finding reasons to fine people who didn't support his policies. Greg's words confirmed James's suspicions. "This whole thing is a racket," Greg muttered. "Richard pushes fake fines, then uses HOA funds like his personal piggy bank. No one stopped him because no one has proof." James smirked. "Now we do." Step 3. Setting the trap. Armed with evidence and witnesses, James knew he needed to catch Richard in the act. So, he did what he did best, set up surveillance. He installed a hidden camera inside his jacket and scheduled a meeting with Richard, pretending he was considering paying the fine. When he walked into the HOA office, Richard was already smirking, confident that he had won. James sat down, pressing record. "I've been thinking about your offer," James said carefully. "Maybe we can work something out." Richard leaned back, smug. "See? That's the smart move, James. Pay the fine, and everything disappears." James tilted his head. "And if I don't?" Richard's smile didn't fade. "Then the lien goes through. After that, we take your house, and trust me, you won't get a fair price." James raised an eyebrow. "And what happens to the houses that get foreclosed?" Richard chuckled. "They get sold at a discount to people who, let's just say, know how to take advantage of opportunities." James's blood boiled, but he kept his face neutral. Richard had just admitted everything on camera. And now, James had everything he needed. Step 4. Bringing in the authorities. The next morning, James met with Detective Maria Reynolds at the Orlando Financial Crimes Division. She had investigated corrupt HOA boards before, but when James showed her the evidence, her eyes widened in disbelief. "This is huge," she muttered, flipping through the files. Blackmail, fraud, illegal liens, money laundering. This could bring the entire board down. James slid the recording device across the table. "Wait until you hear this." They listened together, and as soon as Richard's voice played, bragging about forcing people into foreclosure for profit, Detective Reynolds snapped the file shut. "I'll get a warrant." James grinned. "Good, because it was time to watch the HOA crumble." Step 5. The takedown. 2 days later, James sat on his front porch, sipping coffee, waiting. At exactly 9:15 a.m., 6 police vehicles rolled into Clearwater Ridge. Homeowners peeked out of their windows, confused, until officers marched straight into the HOA office. Within minutes, Richard Lawson and 3 other board members were escorted out in handcuffs. The neighborhood exploded in whispers and gasps. James stood, walking up just as Richard was being placed in the back of a squad car. Richard's face was pale, his smirk completely gone. "You..." James smirked back. "Guess you won't be running your scam anymore." Richard lunged forward, but the officer shoved him into the car. James watched as a police convoy drove away, leaving behind a stunned but cheering neighborhood. The aftermath. Taking back the community. With Richard and his corrupt board facing felony charges, Clearwater Ridge was left in chaos. So, the homeowners did something no one expected. They voted to dissolve the HOA. James helped organize a new community association, but this time, no mandatory fees, no ridiculous fines, no power-hungry dictators running things. And for the first time in years, Clearwater Ridge felt like a real neighborhood again. As James walked back to his house that evening, his phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Corrupt HOA president faces 10-plus years in prison for fraud, extortion, and money laundering. James smirked, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Richard had thought he could blackmail him into paying fake fines. Instead, he ended up paying for his crimes behind bars. And James? He got to sit back and enjoy the peace and quiet of his newly HOA-free home. With Richard Lawson and his corrupt HOA board facing felony charges, Clearwater Ridge was left in chaos. The HOA office was shut down, its files seized as evidence, and homeowners who had spent years living in fear of absurd fines and power-hungry board members were now left wondering what would happen next. But James Weston already had a plan. The day after the arrests, he called a community meeting, inviting every resident to the local clubhouse, a building that, until now, had been reserved for the HOA board's exclusive use. Over 100 homeowners showed up, many of them still in shock from what had just happened. James stood at the front of the room, clearing his throat. "We have a decision to make," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We can either elect a new board and keep the HOA alive, or we can vote to dissolve it permanently." A murmur spread through the crowd. For years, the HOA had ruled with an iron fist, weaponizing fees, fines, and foreclosures against homeowners who dared to question their authority. Now, they had the chance to reclaim their community. An older woman near the front, Mrs. Patel, raised her hand. "What happens if we get rid of the HOA?" James gestured to the document on the table, a legal dissolution petition. "If we dissolve it, the control of the neighborhood goes back to us. No more mandatory fees. No more nonsense fines. No more threats of losing your home over a flower bed violation." A man in the back, Greg Thompson, a former board member who had resigned in protest years ago, stood up. "And who would handle maintenance? Security? Landscaping?" James smiled. "Simple. We start a voluntary neighborhood association. No power-hungry board. No force fees. Just homeowners coming together to decide what's actually needed." Silence hung in the air for a moment. Then, one by one, people started nodding, clapping, and cheering. "Let's get rid of it," someone shouted. "This HOA has done nothing but steal from us," another voice added. By the end of the night, the vote was unanimous. Clearwater Ridge HOA was officially dissolved. And for the first time in years, people felt free. James's final victory. With the HOA gone, James made sure that every homeowner who had been wrongfully fined, foreclosed on, or threatened received justice. With the money from the lawsuit, he helped reimburse families who had been victims of the HOA's fraudulent schemes. The old HOA office, it was turned into a community space, open to everyone, where residents could organize their own neighborhood events without needing permission from a corrupt board. As for Richard Lawson, the man who had once threatened James with foreclosure was now sitting in a jail cell, facing a decade behind bars for his fraud, blackmail, and money laundering scheme. One evening, as James sat on his porch, sipping a cold beer, his neighbor, Greg, walked up, shaking his head. "Damn," Greg chuckled. "Never thought I'd see the day this place was HOA-free." James grinned. "Neither did I." He raised his bottle. "To taking back what's ours." And with that, he kicked back, watching the sunset, knowing that he had just won a war that most people thought was unwinnable.